Hello again, everybody. This is Dr. Robinson, aka Rusty, aka William Robinson, and I'm your host for the podcast today. I am also the Blues Doctor. This is the first episode of our new podcast, and we're going to talk about a lot of things. We'll talk about medicine specifically because I am a physician. I'm a retired professor of oncology at a major university. So we're going to talk about cancer a lot in specific. I am also a semi-professional blues musician, at least I like to think I am. So we're going to talk about music in general, including the blues and including New Orleans style music, which is fascinating as far as I'm concerned. One of my other interests is in the area of high strangeness or Bigfoot and other things like that. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. I've actually been on a couple of Bigfoot hunts, so I may relate some of my experiences on that to you as well. At any rate, we hope you stay with us. This is going to be a weekly podcast, so please hit the thumbs up button, subscribe, and share. Please, we'd love to have you come back and see us in the future. Now let's get on the topics. First off, I'd like to talk a little bit about the calendar, the musical calendar of the week. There's several interesting musical dates, I guess you want to call it this week, for birthdays. For example, maybe the most important birthday this week is that of Kurt Cobain, who was born February 20th, 1967. Kurt, as many of you know, was an iconic singer, songwriter, guitarist. He was one of the pioneers, in fact, maybe the main contributor to the grunge era of music. And Kurt was a very gifted but troubled young man in many ways. Unfortunately, he ended up committing suicide in 1994, and we miss him greatly. Also, for birthdays, this is a good one for New Orleans, so our New Orleans crowd will appreciate this. Ernest Cador, aka Ernie Cado, was born in New Orleans in 1933 on February 21st. His big hit from 1962 was Mother-in-Law, and I imagine some of you all at least have heard that song. It actually made it to number one on the charts in 1962. Ernie was one of New Orleans' real characters. He frequently would come on stage with wearing a cape and a crown, and he sometimes would call himself the Emperor of the Universe. Ernie founded his own bar named the Mother-in-Law Lounge in the Treme neighborhood in New Orleans. Ernie died about 15 years ago, and his wife continued to run the lounge. Her name was Antoinette until she died shortly before the pandemic, I believe. Recent years, that lounge is still open. It's been taken over by another New Orleans musician named Kermit Ruffins, and is going strong to this day. If you ever get a chance to go to New Orleans, you want to hear some authentic music, check out Ernie's Mother-in-Law Lounge in the Treme neighborhood. Okay, and another birthday, Johnny Cash was born in February 26, 1932 in eastern Arkansas, about 50 miles from Memphis. I think everybody has at least heard of Johnny Cash, maybe the most influential of the old Stax and Sun Records musicians to come from the city of Memphis. He's beloved by many in the country field, in the rock field, and crossovers. Johnny died just a few years ago. I guess it's now been 10 years ago. And he is very much missed. He has left a wonderful legacy of music. So, happy birthday, Johnny. Okay, here's for the healthcare topic of the week. This topic I became aware of about 2 weeks ago, I guess. There have been a couple of recent changes that were announced by the Trump administration in the way that cancer research is being funded. So, first off, you may recall 2-3 weeks ago, it was announced that there would be a hold on all research funding, including grants, meetings, travel, everything else. Now, they quickly backed off that after maybe a week or so that the grants are being funded, current grants are now being funded. But there's still some uncertainty about what they're going to do with funding from the NIH and the NCI in specific going forward. Another, and maybe certainly a more specific and maybe more contentious issue is that the Trump administration has proposed capping federal funding for what is called indirect costs at 15%. Now, this is a complex topic, and in fact, many physicians and even investigators don't fully understand this topic. So let me back up a little bit. The cost of a grant or grant application is calculated when the federal government, in the form of the NCI, sends out a request for proposals. In other words, this is ideas for research that they are suggesting that they might be willing to pay for. In turn, investigators like me and many other people around the country would look at those requests and decide we could answer that question potentially with funding, and you write up a grant application, which may be very long, maybe a couple of hundred pages, and that grant application will include a budget, which has to be very detailed, including everything from test tubes to mailing supplies to personnel costs to whatever else goes into the cost of performing the experiments that you need to accomplish your project. Now, the indirect cost, and that's what this issue is about, is a little different. So what happens is that if you're an investigator, you come up with your grant application, including the budget. Your institution then takes it, usually a school, but not necessarily, then takes that grant application and uses a formula to calculate what they call the indirect costs. In most schools, the indirect costs are something around 50% or so. There are a few that are higher. I know some of the Ivy League schools are as high as 65 or 70%. And those indirect costs are intended to go to overhead, if you can imagine that. So keeping the lights on is the term frequently used, or the phrase frequently used by administrators. And like I said, they add that then to the total cost of the grant and ask for that money from the NCI, in other words, from the federal government. So whatever your grant budget is as an investigator has an addition of about 50% on top of that they're really asking the feds for. Now, one of the issues with that is that investigators rarely to never really know what the indirect costs are going for. And the formula for calculating indirect costs is so complex and so nebulous that it's pretty much a secret. Nobody's ever explained it to me in any way that I could fully understand. And I've done this many times over many years. So what is the indirect cost really used for? A lot of us suspect that it's potentially just going into the school's general fund and that we never see it again. I can tell you, in all the grants I've ever gotten funded, I have no idea what happens to the indirect costs. So the Trump administration has made the decision that maybe we're overpaying schools in indirect costs. You know, some of these schools are sitting on endowments of as much as $1 billion. Do you really need to pay them at that level? So maybe 15%, according to the Trump administration, would be a more appropriate way to reimburse indirect costs. Now, I don't really have a problem with that. I think that might be appropriate. The indirect costs that the NCI pays for are really just another part of the grant. It's really more like, in my mind, a tax on the grant that goes to the school itself. So I'm not sure that decreasing the amount is necessarily a bad thing. Until we get some clarification of where those indirect costs are going, which we have not really had, I think it might be reasonable for the administration to lower the indirect costs. In fact, that's part of the reason it's being lowered, is that the funds can't be documented. They're not transparent. We don't know where the indirect costs are going. Overall, my assessment of these two issues, these two recent federal issues is this. Number one, it was inappropriate to hold all federal funding out of the blue, and I think they've caught on to that. I think the government has realized that if you do that, you risk wasting all of the funding that you've already had, because if you have experiments in progress, say, if you suddenly have to stop funding, then you may lose the effort that you've already put into it. So that's a bad idea. That actually would lose money in the longer term. And on the other hand, reducing the indirect costs, as I explained, I think is probably a reasonable thing to do, unless the schools can be more transparent about where those costs are going and can justify the use of those costs. Another thing that I wanted to talk about on this week's podcast, and in general, is a weekly song or a weekly piece of music that has intrigued me for some reason. And I've actually got a backlog of music in my head that I'd like to talk about on here. I managed to narrow that down to one specific piece. It's related to New Orleans. You'll probably hear a lot about New Orleans music during this podcast. So I picked out an album by Walter Wolfman Washington. It's titled Feel So at Home. This was the last album that Walter recorded before he died. He died at age 79 in 2022. Walter was a legendary bluesman, guitarist, singer in New Orleans. He's been all over the world several times. He's recorded with any number of big names in the industry, and it's truly beloved in New Orleans. I had the honor to say Walter was a friend and to have played with him, performed with him on several occasions. So Feel So at Home, like I said, it was his last album. It was really a reflection of his whole career because he mixed a number of genres in this one, including jazz, blues, even country and rock to some degree, to reflect his home, and that is New Orleans, Louisiana. So I can strongly recommend Walter's album, Feel So at Home. Pick it up if you get a chance, take a listen to it. It's a good representation of modern New Orleans music, and it's a good man who made it. In fact, I'll put a link in the description below so that you can download the album. I think you'll enjoy it. Okay, some other musical interests in the news of late. And what did you think? You know, I have utmost respect for Sir Paul with all he's contributed to the music industry over, decades now. But sometimes you have to wonder, when is it time to stop? The combination of John Lennon and Paul McCartney, I think, without question, were the greatest composers of the 20th century. We're now in the 21st century. Paul's performance on Saturday Night Live was live, and it was kind of ragged. His voice is not what it used to be. There were a number of critics that noticed that and commented on that in the national news. He can apparently still play the piano, play the guitar, play the bass guitar as well as he ever could. But not surprisingly, his voice has changed. Paul's 82 years old now. So many of us, most of us probably, experience that to some degree as we get older. I was reminded particularly of Paul's performance today when I saw that there's going to be another tour by the great Neil Young coming up in 2025. Neil is pretty much a contemporary of Paul's. And you have to wonder about Neil too. Is he going to be able to do what he did 50 years ago? Now, I will say the bar for Neil is nowhere near as high as the bar for Paul McCartney. Neil's singing was quirky at best. His guitar playing was unusual, if not, many people thought very intricate and rewarding. You can take that as you will. So, I don't know. Paul has contributed so much to us. Maybe it doesn't matter what the bar is. We'll just have to keep watching. As long as he keeps wanting to work and is willing to work, people will keep paying him, I'm sure. So we'll see how that goes. Okay. Some of my other interests, like I mentioned before, include things like high strangeness, or Bigfoot / UFOs / ghosts / whatever you want to call it, anything that's odd or unusual. As my wife would say, it's the weird stuff that I'm interested in. So I may mention a few of those things here on the podcast from time to time. There was one that came up recently that I thought I'd share here, and this was a bill introduced into the California legislature by an assemblyman named Shane Galvan. No, I take that back. Shane Galvan was the author of the story written about this bill. This story appeared in the New York Post, and the headline is, California bill aims to recognize Bigfoot as the state's official cryptid. That's correct. As you may know, there have been any number of sightings of Bigfoot in California, including the famous Patterson-Gimlin film from 1967, and many others. The bill wasn't, in fact, introduced to the California Assembly by Assemblyman Chris Rogers, who was quoted, "The state is facing so many challenges currently that maybe injecting a little levity in the Assembly might be a good thing." I think I could agree with that. And, I admit I don't fully understand the Bigfoot phenomena, but I think if you can't laugh about yourself, even if you're open to Bigfoot in general, then, you've lost something. So I'm going to put a link below to that New York Post article for you as well, because I thought it was interesting. And that's about all I had for today. I hope you have enjoyed the podcast today. I hope you share it with our friends. We want our numbers to grow. We're going to keep this up on a weekly basis. I will be here each time. Depending on circumstances, we can grow our numbers. We'd like to invite guests on with us. We might even consider going live at times to talk to some of my compatriots in any of those fields, be it music or medicine or Bigfoot or whatever. So, my prescription, Blues Doctor's prescription for this week is to listen to the Blues Doctor Recommends podcast. And I hope to see you next time. Thank you so much. Good night.